Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change everything. Sometimes a man who thinks his heart died long ago discovers it was just waiting for the right moment to beat again. High up on Elk Ridge, old Boone Carver lived alone after losing his family to fever. One snowy night, a dying woman stumbled to his door. He fed her and gave her shelter. The next morning, 300 orphans appeared at his cabin, walking through the snow like they knew exactly where to find him. How did one bowl of stew bring an army of forgotten children to his doorstep? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind through the pines always sounded like voices to Boone Carver, especially in the long hours before dawn when sleep refused to come. He'd grown accustomed to their whispered conversations over the 10 years since he'd climbed up to Elk Ridge and built his cabin in the shadow of Cathedral Rock. The voices never said anything useful, mind you, but they kept him company in a way that flesh and blood folks no longer could. His cabin sat at 8,000 feet, where the air ran thin and the winters bit deep enough to freeze a man's soul if he wasn't careful. Boone had chosen this place precisely because it discouraged visitors. The trail up from Millerville was treacherous enough in good weather and downright murderous when the snows came. Most sensible people stayed in the valley where life was easier and conversation was plentiful. But Boone Carver had lost his taste for easy living the day the fever took his family. The faded daguerreotype on his mantelpiece showed them as they'd been in better days. Martha with her gentle smile and eyes that sparkled with mischief, little Annie perched on his lap with her wild curls escaping from their ribbons, and the boys, Samuel and Thomas, standing proud and straight in their Sunday clothes. Martha had insisted on the photograph for their 5th wedding anniversary, though Boone had grumbled about the expense. "We need something to remember this moment," she'd said. And Lord help him, he was grateful now for her stubborn streak. The fever had come in late summer of 1878, carried into town by a traveling preacher who'd meant to bring salvation but delivered death instead. It started with Annie, who'd always been delicate, then spread to the boys despite their strong constitutions. Martha had nursed them all with fierce determination, never leaving their sides until she too fell to the same sickness that claimed their children. Doc Hensley had done everything medical science could offer, which in those days wasn't much beyond cool cloths and fervent prayer. Boone had watched helplessly as the light faded from each beloved face, feeling more powerless than he'd ever felt in his 43 years of living. When it was over, when the last shovelful of dirt had been thrown over Martha's grave in the Millerville cemetery, something had broken inside him that all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put back together. The townspeople had tried to help, bless them. Pastor Williams had spoken of God's mysterious ways and the promise of reunion in heaven. Sarah May from the general store had brought casseroles and kind words. Even gruff old Mayor Patterson had offered to find him work to keep his mind occupied. But their sympathy felt like salt in an open wound, and their well-meaning platitudes rang hollow as church bells in an empty valley. So Boone had packed what remained of his life into 2 worn saddlebags, sold everything else for a handful of dollars, and ridden up the mountain trail to where the world couldn't follow. He'd built his cabin with his own 2 hands, 1 log at a time, working through the grief until his muscles ached and his mind was too tired for sorrow. The physical labor had been a kind of medicine, though it never fully healed what was broken inside him. The cabin was solid work, built to last through whatever storms the mountain could throw at it. 20 feet by 30, with a stone fireplace that drew well, and windows facing east to catch the morning light. He dug a root cellar for storing provisions, and built a lean-to for his horse, a steady bay mare named Patience, who seemed to understand his need for solitude. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles down the mountain, which suited him fine. His days followed a rhythm as predictable as sunrise. Wake before dawn, tend to Patience, check his snares and fish lines, chop wood for the fire, prepare simple meals, and speak to no one but the wind. In summer, he hunted deer and elk. In autumn, he gathered berries and nuts, and when winter locked the world in ice, he lived off his stores and waited for spring like a bear in hibernation. Doc Hensley made the climb twice a year, once in late spring and once in early fall, ostensibly to check on Boone's health, but really to satisfy his own conscience about leaving a friend to live like a hermit. The good doctor would stay for a night or two, sharing news from the valley and making sure Boone hadn't completely lost touch with civilization. "You can't live like this forever," Doc would say, settling his considerable bulk into the room's only chair while Boone perched on a wooden crate. "A man needs fellowship, needs purpose beyond mere survival." "I've got all the purpose I need," Boone would reply, gesturing toward the stack of firewood that never seemed to diminish no matter how much he burned. "Wood don't chop itself, and this cabin won't maintain itself." Doc Hensley was a persistent man, trained by years of medical practice to probe where others might retreat. "Martha wouldn't want this for you, Boone. She'd want you to find some measure of happiness again." "Don't presume to know what Martha would want," Boone would answer, though without real anger. Doc meant well, and Boone harbored no ill will toward him. "She's beyond wanting anything now, and I'm beyond providing it." The truth was more complicated than Boone let on. In quiet moments, usually in the hour before sleep when the fire burned low and shadows danced on the cabin walls, he could almost imagine Martha sitting across from him, mending clothes or reading from one of her books. She'd been the educated one in their family, daughter of a schoolteacher who'd filled her head with poetry and philosophy. Sometimes she'd read aloud while he worked, her voice flowing like honey over the evening air. "You're thinking too hard again," she'd say, when she caught him staring into the fire instead of listening to her words. "Life's complicated enough, without adding extra worry to it." Martha had possessed a gift for finding joy in simple things. The first wild flowers of spring, fresh bread cooling on the windowsill, their children's laughter echoing through the house. She'd tried to teach him that gift, but he'd always been too practical, too focused on providing and protecting to properly appreciate the small blessings that filled their days. Now those memories were all he had, and he guarded them jealously against the erosion of time. He'd kept a few of Martha's books, reading the same passages over and over until he could recite them from memory. Her favorite was a collection of poems by someone named Wordsworth, full of observations about nature and the human heart. Boone didn't pretend to understand all the fancy language, but Martha's voice lived in those verses, and that was enough. The people of Millerville had long since stopped expecting him to return. Sarah May still set aside supplies when Doc Hensley made his visits: coffee, salt, sugar, and other necessities that couldn't be hunted or foraged, but she no longer asked after his welfare or sent messages urging him to come home. Pastor Williams had given up his periodic letters about the spiritual danger of isolation. Even the tax collector had stopped making the treacherous climb, apparently deciding that the few dollars Boone owed weren't worth the risk to life and limb. This arrangement suited everyone involved. Boone got the solitude he craved, and the townspeople could sleep easy knowing they'd tried their Christian duty by a grieving neighbor. He'd become a legend of sorts in the valley, the hermit of Elk Ridge, the man who'd loved so deeply that losing love had driven him to the mountains like some Old Testament prophet. Children in Millerville were told his story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of setting your heart too firmly on earthly things. "See what happens when a man makes idols of family," Pastor Williams would say during his Sunday sermons. "He loses sight of the eternal and finds himself lost in the wilderness of his own making." But Boone didn't feel lost. Exactly. Damaged, certainly. Hollowed out like a tree struck by lightning. But not lost. He knew exactly where he was and why he was there. This mountain was his refuge, his monastery, his place of penance for the sin of loving too much and losing everything. Winter was hardest, when the snow piled deep enough to bury a man and the cold turned breath to crystals in the air. Those were the times when loneliness pressed against him like a physical weight, when the silence grew so complete it seemed to have substance. He'd learned to fill those hours with work, carving spoons and bowls from pine wood, repairing tools and tack, reading Martha's books by firelight until his eyes burned. But even in the depths of winter's fury, when the wind howled like souls in torment and the snow fell thick enough to blind a man at 10 paces, Boone never seriously considered leaving his mountain sanctuary. This was his chosen life, his deliberate exile, and he'd grown comfortable with its rhythms and restrictions. The morning the woman came to his door, Boone had been living this way for exactly 10 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Not that he kept count, mind you. But a man notices the anniversaries of his losses, whether he wants to or not. December was always the cruelest month, when the fever had taken his family and left him alone in a world that suddenly seemed too big and too empty for one man to fill. He'd been splitting kindling behind the cabin when the storm hit, one of those sudden mountain blizzards that could turn a clear day deadly in the space of an hour. The wind came first, bending the pines like grass and sending his carefully stacked wood flying in all directions. Then came the snow, thick and wet, and driven horizontal by the gale. Boone gathered what wood he could and fought his way back to the cabin, knowing that anyone caught in the open would be dead within the hour. He barred the door, fed the fire, and settled in to wait out nature's tantrum. It was going to be a long night, but he'd weathered worse storms in his decade on the mountain. He was heating coffee when he heard the knocking. The knocking was weak at first, barely audible above the wind's howling, but it carried a desperate rhythm that cut through the storm's chaos like a blade through silk. Boone froze with his coffee cup halfway to his lips, wondering if his mind was playing tricks on him. 10 years of solitude could make a man hear things that weren't there, and the wind often mimicked human sounds when it caught the cabin's eaves just right. But the knocking came again, more insistent now, accompanied by a voice so faint it might have been his imagination. "Please," it whispered through the thick timber door. "Please, someone help me." Boone set down his cup with hands that trembled slightly, whether from the cold or something deeper he couldn't say. In all his years on the mountain, no one had ever come to his door in weather like this. The trail was treacherous enough in good conditions, but attempting it during a blizzard was tantamount to suicide. He lifted the heavy bar that secured the door and pulled it open against the wind's resistance. What he saw made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. A woman stood swaying on his threshold, more ghost than flesh, her clothes frozen stiff with ice and snow. Her lips were blue as winter shadows, her skin the color of old parchment, and her eyes, Lord help him, her eyes held the same desperate exhaustion he'd seen in Martha's face during those final days of fever. She clutched something against her chest, a small dark bundle that took him a moment to recognize as a book. "The children," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "They're coming. I promised I'd find them sanctuary." Then she collapsed forward into his arms like a rag doll cut loose from its strings. Boone caught her instinctively, muscle memory from years of caring for Martha overriding his decade of isolation. The woman weighed almost nothing, as if the storm had already begun claiming pieces of her soul. Her skin burned with fever despite the ice crystals in her hair, and her breathing came in shallow gasps that rattled in her chest like dice in a cup. He carried her to his bed, the only bed in the cabin, and began the familiar ritual of fighting death for a human life. Strip away the frozen clothes, wrap her in every blanket and fur he owned. Build up the fire until the cabin became a furnace, heat water and try to get warm broth past her chattering teeth. The motions came back to him as if no time had passed at all, as if he was still the man who'd once tended his sick family with desperate love. But this time felt different. This time carried the weight of second chances and last hopes, though he couldn't have explained why, if pressed. As he worked, the woman drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling words that made little sense. "Sister Catherine," she would whisper. Then, moments later, the little ones, they trusted me. Sometimes she would clutch at his shirt with surprising strength and say, "Boone, is it really you, Boone?" That stopped him cold. How did this dying stranger know his name? In 10 years, only Doc Hensley had spoken it aloud in this cabin, and Doc was safely in Millerville, probably warming himself by Sarah May's store fire. He studied the woman's face in the firelight, searching for recognition in features gaunt with starvation and fever. There was something familiar about the shape of her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, but he couldn't place it. Memory was a treacherous thing, especially when desperation and exhaustion clouded both his perception and hers. "Who are you?" he asked during one of her lucid moments. "How do you know my name?" But she was already slipping away again, back into whatever fevered dreams had carried her through the storm. Her lips moved soundlessly, and her fingers traced invisible patterns on the quilt Martha had sewn 20 years ago. The book she'd been clutching, a worn leather Bible, lay beside her, like a faithful dog waiting for its master to wake. Boone picked up the Bible with reverent hands. It was old, its binding cracked and pages yellowed with age, but someone had cared for it lovingly. Pressed flowers marked various passages, and the margins were filled with delicate handwriting in a script he didn't recognize. Children's names were written on the inside cover in different hands: Tommy, Sarah, Marcus, Lucy, and dozens more, as if the book had been signed by an entire congregation. As the night wore on, the woman's condition worsened. Her fever climbed until she felt like a coal fresh from the fire, and her breathing became more labored with each passing hour. Boone had seen enough death to recognize its approach, and despite his best efforts with cool cloths and warm broth, he knew this battle was already lost. Near dawn, as the storm's fury finally began to subside, she opened her eyes one last time. They were clear now, freed from fever's grip by death's approaching peace. "Catherine," she whispered, her voice clear as mountain spring water. "My name is Catherine." The name hit him like a physical blow. Catherine. His sister Catherine, lost to him for more than 15 years after their parents died, and they'd been scattered to different relatives. Catherine, who'd been 8 years old when he'd last seen her, standing on a train platform with tears streaming down her face as she'd been taken to live with their aunt in street. "Louis, Kathy," he breathed, and suddenly he could see the little girl she'd been in this dying woman's face. The same stubborn chin, the same eyes that sparkled with intelligence and mischief. "Oh God, Kathy, what happened to you? I've been looking for you," she said, her hand finding his with surprising warmth. "For so long, Boone, I heard about Martha and the children. I'm so sorry." His throat closed with grief too large for words. Here was the sister he'd mourned as lost forever, and she was slipping away, just as surely as his wife and children had. Life, it seemed, delighted in offering gifts with one hand while snatching them away with the other. "The children," Catherine continued, her grip tightening with desperate urgency. 300 orphans from Street Mary's. There was a fire. I led them away, but the journey was too much for me. They're following my trail, Boone. They'll be here soon. 300 children. The number was so large it defied comprehension. Where are they now? In this storm? Safe, she breathed. I found them shelter in the caves below Cathedral Rock. They'll come when the storm passes, following the path I blazed for them. They're good children, Boone. Lost and scared, but good. Kathy, I don't know how to... You do know, she said, and for a moment her voice carried the authority of the woman she'd become, rather than the child he remembered. You were always the one who protected me. Now protect them. Love them like you loved your pati, own family. The irony was bitter as winter wind. She was asking him to do the one thing he'd sworn never to do again, to open his heart to others, to risk the devastating pain of loss. He'd built these walls around his soul for good reason. I can't, he whispered. I won't survive losing them too. Catherine smiled then, and for an instant he saw the mischievous little girl who'd followed him everywhere, who'd believed her big brother could fix anything that was broken in the world. "Sometimes," she said, "love is worth the risk of losing it. Sometimes it's the only thing that makes life worth living." Her eyes drifted closed, and her breathing became the soft whisper of wind through grass. Boone held her hand as her spirit slipped away, feeling the familiar ache of powerlessness that had haunted him since Martha's death. But this time, the loss carried with it something else, a burden of responsibility that settled on his shoulders like a mantle he couldn't refuse. As the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky, Catherine drew her last breath with the same peaceful acceptance that had marked Martha's passing. Boone sat beside her for a long time, his hand still holding hers, trying to absorb the magnitude of what she'd asked of him. 300 orphans, coming to his mountain sanctuary, trusting in the promise of a dying woman who'd been his sister. His lost family returned to him only to be taken away again. Outside, the storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving the world wrapped in pristine snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the morning light. Somewhere in that crystalline silence, hundreds of children were preparing to climb toward his cabin, following a trail blazed by faith and desperation. Boone looked at Catherine's peaceful face, then at the Bible she'd carried through the storm. Inside its pages lay the names of the children she'd died protecting, children who would soon be his responsibility, whether he was ready or not. Boone had barely finished wrapping Catherine's body in his best blanket when he heard them coming. At first, it was just a whisper of sound carried on the mountain wind, footsteps crunching through fresh snow, the soft murmur of voices trying to stay quiet. Then the sounds grew closer, more distinct, and his heart began to race with a mixture of dread and disbelief. He stepped onto his porch and looked down the mountainside toward the tree line, where the trail emerged from the forest. What he saw there defied every rational thought his mind could muster. They came like a river of humanity flowing through the white wilderness, a seemingly endless line of small figures trudging through snow that reached their knees. Some carried younger children on their backs, others held hands in chains of mutual support. All of them moved with the determined exhaustion of people who had traveled too far and endured too much, but refused to surrender. 300 children. Catherine hadn't been. Delirious, after all. The oldest looked to be perhaps 15, walking at the front of the group with the bearing of someone forced to grow up too quickly. The youngest couldn't have been more than 5, bundled in coats too large for their small frames and struggling to keep pace with their older companions. They were a rainbow of faces, some pale as winter morning, others dark as rich earth, many bearing the mixed heritage of the frontier where cultures blended like streams flowing into a common river. Boone stood frozen on his porch, his mind reeling as he tried to comprehend the impossible scene unfolding before him. Where would they sleep? What would they eat? His cabin could barely accommodate him and his few possessions, let alone an army of displaced children. His winter stores might feed one man until spring, but spread among 300 hungry mouths, they wouldn't last a week. The lead boy, for that's what he was, barely more than a child himself despite his serious expression, raised his hand to halt the group about 50 yards from the cabin. He approached alone, his boots making crisp sounds in the snow, and Boone could see the weight of responsibility in every line of his young face. "You're Mr. Carver," the boy said, and it wasn't a question. He had intelligent brown eyes and prematurely grey streaks in his dark hair that spoke of burdens no child should carry. "Sister Catherine told us you'd help us. She said you were her brother and that you knew about taking care of people." "I don't know anything about taking care of anyone," Boone replied, the words coming out harsher than he'd intended. "I've been alone on this mountain for 10 years for good reason." "Sister Catherine died, didn't she?" the boy asked quietly. "We saw the smoke from your chimney burning all night, and she was so sick when she left us. I'm Tommy Sullivan, and I promised her I'd look after the little ones if something happened." The simple acceptance in Tommy's asmutagly. voice cut through Boone's defenses like a blade through cloth. Here was a child who'd already seen too much death, too much loss, and yet still found the strength to care for others. It reminded him painfully of himself at that age, trying to be strong for Catherine after their parents died. "How long since you've eaten?" Boone asked, though he already dreaded the answer. "Yesterday morning. We had some bread and dried meat Sister Catherine saved for us, but it's gone now." Tommy gestured toward the group of children waiting patiently in the snow. "The little ones are hungry, and some of them are getting sick from the cold." Boone looked past Tommy to the sea of small faces, watching him with expressions that ranged from hope to exhaustion to barely concealed fear. Near the back of the group, he spotted a tiny girl with tangled blonde hair who couldn't have been older than his Annie would have been. She was wearing what looked like a mitten on only one hand. The other must have been lost somewhere along their impossible journey. That single missing mitten broke something loose inside him, some dam that had been holding back 10 years of accumulated compassion. He thought of his own children, how they'd looked when fever had made them weak and vulnerable. No child should have to stand in the snow, hungry and cold, waiting for an adult to decide their fate. "Can you organize them?" Boone asked Tommy. "Get the youngest ones inside first, out of this cold. I'll see what food I can put together." Relief flooded Tommy's young face. "Yes, sir, Mr. Carver. We're good at organizing. Sister Catherine taught us how to take care of each other." As Tommy hurried back to marshal the children, Boone stepped inside his cabin and surveyed his meager supplies with new eyes. He had perhaps 50 pounds of flour, dried beans, salt pork, and other staples that were meant to last him through the winter. There was coffee, precious and expensive, and sugar enough for a few. Weeks of sweetening. It wasn't nearly enough to feed 300 people for any length of time, but it would have to do until he could figure out something else. He pulled out his largest pot, a cast-iron beast that Martha had used to feed his work crews back when he'd taken on carpentry jobs around Millerville. He hadn't used it in years, but it was big enough to make a stew that could at least give each child a warm bowl of something nourishing. The first group of children filed through his door with the quiet discipline of people accustomed to hardship. They removed their wet boots without being asked and found places to sit on his floor, their eyes wide as they took in the warm, safe interior of his cabin. Many of them had clearly been crying, but they wiped their faces quickly and tried to look brave for the younger ones. "What happened to your orphanage?" Boone asked Tommy as he began cutting salt pork into his pot. "Fire," Tommy replied simply. "Started in the kitchen. One night, about 2 weeks ago. Sister Catherine got us all out, but the building was lost. The church people in town said they'd find places for us, but they wanted to split us up. Send us to different families, different towns. Sister Catherine said families should stay together, even if they weren't born that way." Boone nodded, understanding more than the boy could know. He'd felt the same way about his own family, that the bonds forged by love and choice were sometimes stronger than those created by blood. Looking at these children, he could see they'd formed their own intricate web of relationships and dependencies. The little girl with the single mitten approached the fire hesitantly, her blue eyes fixed on his face with the intensity only children could muster. She couldn't have been more than 6, with hair that might have been golden if it wasn't matted with dirt and travel. "Are you the angel lady's brother?" she asked, in a voice soft as whisper. She said her brother would take care of us like a papa. The words hit him like a physical blow. Papa. He'd thought he'd never hear that word applied to himself again, had convinced himself he didn't want to. But looking at this child's trusting face, he felt the old protective instincts stirring deep in his chest. "What's your name, little one?" he asked, crouching down to her level. "Lucy," she said. "Lucy. Mary Catherine Thompson. I lost my mittens somewhere in the snow, and now my hand is cold." Without thinking, Boone pulled off his own worn wool mittens and gently placed them on her small hands. They were far too large, but they were warm, and Lucy's face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen from any of the children. "There," he said. "That should help until we can find you proper mittens." As he stood and returned to his cooking, Boone felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes watching his every move. These children had placed their trust in Catherine's promise, and now that promise had been transferred to him. Whether he was ready or not, he had become their last hope. The stew would be thin, but it would be warm and nourishing. Beyond that, he'd have to trust that somehow, some way, they'd all figure out how to survive together on this mountain that had been his sanctuary and might now become their salvation. The first night was chaos dressed up as organization. Boone's cabin, designed for solitary living, groaned under the weight of 60 small bodies, all the youngest children who could fit inside the 4 walls. The rest made do with whatever shelter they could create from pine boughs, salvaged canvas, and pure determination. Tommy had proven himself a natural leader, dividing the older children into groups and assigning them responsibilities. Some gathered firewood from the forest. Others melted snow for drinking water. A few of the teenage girls organized sleeping arrangements with the efficiency of seasoned camp followers. But despite their best efforts, it was clear this arrangement couldn't last more than a few days. Boone's cooking pot had become the center of their universe. He'd managed to stretch his salt pork and beans into a thin but nourishing stew that filled every bowl at least once. The children ate with the focused intensity of people who'd known real hunger, and many asked for second helpings that simply didn't exist. "Tomorrow I'll check my snares," Boone told Tommy as they surveyed the organized chaos around them. "Maybe bring down a deer if we're lucky. But I need to be honest with you, son. My winter stores won't feed this many people for long." "We're not helpless," Tommy replied with quiet dignity. "Most of us have been working since we were old enough to hold a broom. Sister Catherine made sure we all learned useful skills. We can hunt, cook, sew, build things. We just need someone to tell us what needs doing." The boy's words carried a weight of experience that reminded Boone uncomfortably of his own childhood. He'd been barely older than Tommy when their parents died, thrust into the role of provider and protector for little Catherine. The memory of that responsibility still ached in his chest like an old wound. "What about the little ones?" Boone asked, watching Lucy and several other small children huddled near his fireplace. "They can't work like the older ones. The little ones are everyone's responsibility," Tommy said simply. "That's how Sister Catherine taught us. In a real family, the strong protect the weak. Nobody gets left behind." As if summoned by their conversation, Lucy approached with careful steps, still wearing Boone's oversized mittens like treasured gloves. Behind her came another child, a boy of perhaps 13, with defiant, dark eyes and the wary posture of someone who'd learned to expect trouble. "This is Marcus," Lucy said with the formal politeness of a child making introductions. "He's been taking care of me since my mama died. Marcus, this is the Angel Lady's brother." Marcus studied Boone with obvious suspicion. "You don't look much like her," he said, his voice carrying the challenge of a young man testing boundaries. "How do we know you're really going to help us?" "Adults make a lot of promises they don't keep." The boy's skepticism was understandable, but painful. Boone could see layers of betrayal and disappointment in those young eyes, the accumulated wisdom of a child who'd learned not to trust easily. "I suppose you don't know," Boone replied honestly. "I haven't made any promises yet, and I'm not sure what promises I can keep. But I'm not going to let children freeze or starve on my mountain if there's anything I can do about it." "That's what Sister Catherine said about you," Marcus replied after a long moment. "She said you were stubborn as a Missouri mule, but you'd never abandon family. She said we were your family now. Family." The word hung between them like smoke from the fire, heavy with implications that Boone wasn't ready to accept. These children weren't his family. They were his sister's responsibility that had been thrust upon him by circumstance and tragedy. But looking at their faces in the firelight, he had to admit they'd already begun working their way into corners of his heart he'd thought permanently sealed. The next morning brought new challenges and small miracles in equal measure. A group of older boys had managed to snare 3 rabbits during the night, while others had discovered a cache of wild onions preserved under the snow. It wasn't much, but combined with Boone's remaining supplies, it would make another day's worth of meals. More importantly, the children had begun adapting to their mountain environment with the resilience that only the young possessed. They'd figured out how to melt snow efficiently for washing and drinking. They'd organized shifts for tending fires and watching over the youngest ones. They'd even begun exploring the mountainside, mapping potential sources of food and materials. "We found caves," announced a freckled girl of about 12 as Boone added rabbit meat to his cooking pot. "Big ones, about half a mile up the ridge. They're deep enough to shelter lots of people, and there's a stream nearby that hasn't frozen over." Tommy nodded enthusiastically. "We could move the whole group there, give you back your cabin. The caves would be warmer than sleeping in the open, and we could build proper shelters around them." Boone considered this suggestion while stirring the pot that had become their lifeline. Moving the children to the caves would solve his immediate space problem, but it would also make them more dependent on his support. If something happened to him, an accident, illness, or any of the dozen dangers that mountain life presented, they'd be stranded without his knowledge of local resources. "The caves are good for emergency shelter," he said finally. "But if you're planning to stay on this mountain through winter, we need something more permanent. Something that won't collapse in a snowslide or flood when the spring thaws come." "You mean build real houses?" Lucy asked, her eyes wide with hope. "Like a real town?" The innocent question sparked something in Boone's imagination. Why not a town? He had carpentry skills that had rusted from disuse, but weren't forgotten. The children had energy and willingness to learn. The mountain had timber and stone in abundance. If they were going to survive here together, they'd need proper shelter anyway. "It would take most of the winter," he said slowly, thinking aloud. "We'd have to work fast before the heavy snows come. And we'd need help from the valley, tools, supplies, things we can't make ourselves." "Doc Hensley would help," Tommy said immediately. "Sister Catherine said he was your friend. Maybe he could convince other people to help too." Boone wasn't so sure about that. The people of Millerville had their own problems and their own families to worry about. Asking them to support 300 orphans would be asking for charity on a scale that might overwhelm their good intentions. But as he looked around at the children gathered in his cabin, their faces bright with hope. Despite their circumstances, he found himself nodding almost against his will. "We'll need a lot of help," he said. "And we'll need to prove we can make this work before winter gets serious. But yes, I suppose we could try building a proper settlement." The cheer that went up from the children was loud enough to shake snow from the cabin's roof. For the first time since Catherine's death, Boone felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. 3 weeks into their mountain life, Boone discovered that 300 children could accomplish things that would take a single man months to achieve. They'd established a routine that would have impressed a military commander: sunrise wake-up, calls, organized meal preparation, work details assigned by age and ability, and evening gatherings around the fire for stories and planning the next day's tasks. The woodworking tools that had sat largely unused in his cabin for the past decade had become instruments of transformation. Under his guidance, the older boys had learned to fell trees safely and split logs into usable lumber. The girls had proven equally adept at construction, their smaller hands perfect for the detailed work of chinking walls and crafting wooden pegs that held joints together. Boone found himself carving constantly spoons for eating, bowls for serving, toys to keep restless hands busy during the long winter evenings. The familiar rhythm of knife against wood soothed something deep in his soul that he'd thought permanently broken. Every curl of shaved pine carried with it memories of making furniture for Martha, toys for his own children, the simple satisfaction of creating something useful and beautiful from raw materials. Little Lucy had appointed herself his official assistant, her serious attention to his every movement, both touching and amusing. She would sit beside him for hours, watching as he shaped wood into useful objects, her small hands attempting to mimic his motions with pieces of kindling. "Why do you make the bowls round?" she asked one evening as he worked by firelight. "Wouldn't square ones be easier?" "Round bowls hold more," Boone explained, his voice gentle in a way that would have surprised his former neighbors. "And they're stronger too. No corners to crack when the wood expands and contracts." "Sister Catherine said you used to make furniture for important people," Lucy said. "She said your chairs were so comfortable that preachers would fall asleep during their own sermons." The mention of Catherine still brought pain, but it was a cleaner hurt now, tempered by the knowledge that her sacrifice had brought these children to safety. "Your sister, Catherine, had a talent for exaggeration," he said, though his lips quirked in what might have been a smile. Their settlement was taking shape with remarkable speed. They'd laid out plans for 6 large cabins arranged in a circle around a central meeting hall, with the cooking and storage facilities at the center, where everyone could access them easily. The older children had proven surprisingly skilled at reading the mountain's terrain, choosing locations that would be protected from wind but still receive morning sunlight. Tommy had emerged as Boone's unofficial second-in-command, displaying leadership abilities that reminded Boone of the young sergeants he'd known during his brief stint in the army 20 years earlier. The boy could organize work crews, settle disputes between the younger children, and maintain morale even when the mountain's harsh weather made progress seem impossible. "We need to talk about the valley," Tommy said one evening, as they reviewed the next day's construction plans. "Some of the children are getting worried about what the townspeople will think when they find out we're here." It was a concern that had been nagging at Boone as well. Word would eventually reach Millerville about the settlement. Doc Hensley would see the smoke from their fires during his next visit, or one of the valley ranchers would spot signs of their presence. When that happened, there would be questions about legal guardianship, property rights, and the ability of one man to care for so many children. "What kind of worried?" Boone asked. "Scared, worried," Tommy replied honestly. "A lot of these children have been moved around before, from family to family, orphanage to orphanage. They're afraid the authorities will come and split us up again." "And what do you think about that?" Tommy was quiet for a long moment, his young face serious in the firelight. "I think Sister Catherine chose you for a reason. She could have led us to any town, any church, any place where they had proper facilities for children. But she brought us here, to you, because she knew something the rest of us don't understand yet." The boy's faith was both humbling and terrifying. Boone had spent 10 years convincing himself that he was unfit for human companionship, let alone the responsibility of caring for others. Yet here were 300 children who seemed to believe otherwise, who'd placed their futures in his uncertain hands based on nothing more than a dying woman's promise. The sound of approaching horses broke through his troubled thoughts. Boone rose quickly, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle he kept near the cabin door. Visitors to his mountain had always been rare, and unexpected arrivals after dark usually meant trouble. "Stay with the children," he told Tommy, then stepped out into the cold night air. 2 riders emerged from the tree line, their horses picking their way carefully through the snow. Even in the darkness, Boone recognized the bulky silhouette of Doc Hensley, though the second rider was a stranger, a thin man in a dark coat, who sat his horse with the rigid posture of someone unaccustomed to mountain travel. "Evening, Boone," Doc called as they approached. "Hope you don't mind unexpected company. This here is Samuel Garrett from the county office. He's got some questions about reports of children on your mountain." Garrett dismounted stiffly and studied the evidence of their settlement with obvious disapproval. Smoke rose from multiple fires, and the sounds of children's voices carried clearly through the crisp air. Even in the darkness, it was impossible to hide the fact that Boone's solitary existence had become something entirely different. "Mr. Carver," Garrett said, his voice carrying the authority of bureaucratic certainty, "I'm here to investigate reports of unlawful assembly and potential child endangerment. How many minors are currently in your custody?" "They're not in my custody," Boone replied carefully. "They're refugees from a fire, seeking temporary shelter until permanent arrangements can be made." 300 children is hardly a temporary situation, Garrett said, pulling out a leather portfolio. "These children need proper care, proper education, proper supervision. What you're attempting here is not only illegal but dangerous." From behind him, Boone heard the cabin door open quietly. Tommy emerged, followed by several of the older children, their faces grave with worry. Lucy slipped past the older children and came to stand beside Boone, her small hand finding his in the darkness. "We're not doing anything dangerous," she said in her clear, sweet voice. "Mr. Boone takes good care of us. He makes us bowls and teaches us how to build things and makes sure everyone gets enough to eat." Garrett looked down at the child with the expression of a man confronting an unwelcome complication. "Child, you don't understand the complexities of proper care. These mountains are no place for children, especially during winter. You belong in proper institutions where trained professionals can see to your needs." "We don't want to go to institutions," Tommy said, his young voice steady despite the obvious fear in his eyes. "We want to stay together, and we want to stay here. This is our home now." Boone felt the weight of 300 lives pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Whatever happened next would determine not just his own future, but the futures of all these children who'd placed their trust in him. The thought terrified him more than any mountain storm or winter hardship ever could. The confrontation with Garrett lasted until well past midnight, with Doc Hensley serving as reluctant mediator between bureaucratic authority and mountain stubbornness. In the end, the county official agreed to delay any immediate action until he could file proper reports with his superiors, but his parting words carried the weight of inevitable bureaucratic machinery. "You have 2 weeks to prepare these children for relocation," Garrett had said, his breath steaming in the cold air. "After that, I'll return with proper authority and adequate transportation. These children will be placed in appropriate institutions where they can receive the care they deserve." The days following Garrett's visit carried a shadow that no amount of industry could dispel. The children worked with desperate energy, as if completing their settlement might somehow prove their right to remain. Cabins rose with remarkable speed, their log walls chinked tight against winter's bite, but everyone understood that bureaucratic decisions rarely took craftsmanship into account. It was during this anxious time that Marcus approached Boone with something wrapped carefully in oiled cloth. The boy had remained aloof since their first meeting, helpful but distant, as if expecting disappointment and preparing himself for it. But now, his young face carried an excitement that broke through his carefully maintained barriers. "I found something," Marcus said, unwrapping his bundle to reveal a folded piece of paper covered in childish drawings and careful lettering. It was in Sister Catherine's things, sewn into the lining of her traveling bag. "I think it's important." Boone took the paper with gentle hands, recognizing immediately that it was some kind of map. The drawings were crude but detailed mountains, rivers, trails, and what looked like building symbols scattered across a landscape that seemed familiar yet strange. "This shows our journey," Marcus explained, pointing to a winding line that crossed the paper from bottom to top. "See here, this is where the orphanage burned down. And this is the route Sister Catherine led us, all the way up to your mountain." As Boone studied the map more carefully, he began to understand its true significance. The symbols weren't random, they marked specific locations along their route, each one labeled in Sister Catherine's careful handwriting. Some were churches that had offered temporary shelter. Others were towns where sympathetic families had provided food and supplies. But most importantly, the map showed their final destination not as his isolated cabin, but as something much larger. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the area around his mountain. Sister Catherine had drawn what appeared to be a planned community, multiple buildings, gardens, workshops, even what looked like a small school. At the bottom of the map, She'd written words that made his throat tighten with emotion. New Haven, a place for lost families to find each other. She planned this whole thing, Marcus said quietly. The fire at the orphanage wasn't just bad luck she had to deal with. She was already planning to bring us here, to build something new, something better than what we had before. Tommy and several other children had gathered around them, drawn by the map's mysterious importance. As they examined Sister Catherine's carefully drawn vision, Boone began to see connections he'd missed before. The locations she'd chosen for buildings took advantage of natural windbreaks and water sources. The garden plots were positioned to maximize sunlight. The whole design showed the careful thought of someone who'd spent years planning this community down to the smallest detail. She wrote letters, said Sarah, one of the teenage girls who'd helped care for the younger children during their journey. Lots of them over the past year. She said she was corresponding with churches and charitable organizations about finding us a permanent home. What kind of letters? Boone asked. Legal ones, mostly. About adoption procedures, property rights, community charters. Sister Catherine was educated. She understood how these things worked. She always said, the law could be our friend if we understood it properly. The implications hit Boone like a physical blow. His sister hadn't simply led these children to him in desperation. She'd orchestrated their arrival as part of a carefully planned legal strategy. Somewhere among her possessions, there might be documents, correspondence, maybe even legal papers that could legitimize their mountain community. We need to search through everything she brought, he said. Every bag, every pocket, every piece of clothing. If Catherine was planning this settlement, she would have prepared legal documentation to support it. The search took most of the day, with children carefully examining every item Sister Catherine had carried on their journey. They found additional maps, letters from various church officials expressing support for her work with orphans, and finally, wrapped in waterproof oilcloth at the bottom of her traveling satchel, a thick bundle of legal documents. Boone's hands trembled as he unfolded papers that bore official seals and formal letterheads. There were letters of introduction from church authorities in Street Louis, adoption papers that had been partially completed but not yet filed, property deeds for land purchases that had apparently never been finalized, and most importantly, a detailed proposal for establishing a chartered community specifically designed to care for displaced children. She was buying land, he said, in amazement as he read through the documents. Not just planning to squat on my mountain, she was in the process of legally purchasing adjacent parcels to create a permanent settlement. Doc Hensley, who had stayed to help with the crisis, leaned over to examine the papers with his physician's careful attention to detail. These look legitimate, he said, after a long moment. If she was working through proper legal channels, it changes everything about your situation with the county. But the purchases weren't completed, Tommy pointed out. What happens if the land sales fell through when she died? It was a stuck, sobering question that dampened their momentary excitement. Legal processes rarely survive the death of their primary advocate, especially when that advocate was a woman with limited financial resources trying to establish an unconventional community for unwanted children. There's one way to find out, Boone said, folding the documents carefully. We need to ride down to Millerville and speak with the land office. If Catherine's purchases can be completed, if her community charter can be activated, then maybe we have a legal foundation to stand on when Garrett returns. And if they can't? Marcus asked, his voice carrying the skepticism of someone who'd learned not to trust in adult promises. Boone looked around at the children's faces, seeing hope warring with fear in their young eyes. These weren't just random orphans anymore. They'd become his responsibility, his family, his reason for caring about the future again. Whatever legal battles lay ahead, he wouldn't face them, passively. Then we find another way, he said firmly. Your sister, our Catherine, didn't plan all this just to have it destroyed by bureaucratic convenience. We're going to make her vision of New Haven a reality, one way or another. The ride down to Millerville felt like traveling backward through time. After weeks surrounded by children's voices and constant activity, the solitude of the mountain trail pressed against Boone with unfamiliar weight. He'd grown accustomed to Lucy's chatter, Tommy's thoughtful questions, even Marcus's challenging stares. Now, alone with just the sound of his horse's hooves crunching through snow, he realized how much his world had changed. Doc Hensley rode beside him, the legal documents secured in his medical bag for safekeeping. They decided that having a respected member of the community present the papers would carry more weight than Boone's own testimony, given his decade of self-imposed exile. "You know this might not work," Doc said, as they approached the edge of town. "Land transactions are complicated things, especially when they involve deceased parties and unconventional purposes." "I know," Boone replied, "but Catherine was clever. If anyone could have found a legal way to make this work, it would have been her." Millerville looked smaller than he remembered, though he supposed that was natural after 10 years of absence. The main street still boasted the same collection of shops and services, but everything seemed somehow diminished, as if the town had shrunk while he wasn't looking. People on the wooden sidewalks paused to stare as he rode past, their faces showing mixtures of curiosity and recognition. The land office occupied a corner building that served double duty as the town's legal archive and unofficial gathering place for local politics. Clarence Morrison, the land agent, was a thin man with meticulous habits who'd been recording property transactions for nearly 30 years. If anyone would understand the legal complexities of Catherine's plans, it would be Morrison. "Well, I'll be damned," Morrison said when they entered his office. "Boone Carver, back from the mountain. Heard you had some excitement up there recently." "News travels fast," Boone replied. "Faster than you might think. Samuel Garrett stopped by yesterday, asking questions about property ownership up on Elk Ridge. Seems he's concerned about squatters using public land for unauthorized purposes." Doc Hensley stepped forward before Boone could respond. "That's actually why we're here, Clarence. We have some documents that might shed light on the legal status of activities on that mountain." Morrison's eyebrows rose as Doc spread Catherine's papers across his desk. The land agent picked up each document with the careful attention of someone trained to spot forgeries and legal irregularities. As he read, his expression shifted from skeptical to surprised to something approaching amazement. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "This woman, Sister Catherine Carver, she was your sister, Boone?" "She was. She initiated purchase proceedings for nearly 800 acres of mountain land, all adjacent to your current claim. The transactions were structured through a church charity organization with backing from multiple congregations across 3 states. Morrison shuffled through additional papers. She also filed preliminary paperwork for incorporating a community specifically designed for the care of displaced children. Boone felt his heart hammering against his ribs. 800 acres. That was enough land to build a proper town with room for expansion and self-sufficiency. What's the status of those purchases? Morrison consulted a thick ledger book, running his finger down columns of entries. The initial deposits were paid, and all legal requirements for the purchases were met. However, the final payments were scheduled to be made over a period of 2 years, with the first major installment due next month. "How much?" Doc Hensley asked quietly. $1,200 for the first installment. The total purchase price is nearly $4,000, to be paid over 24 months with interest. The number hit Boone like a punch to the stomach. $4,000 might as well have been $4 million for all his ability to pay it. His savings from his hermit years amounted to perhaps $50, and that was being generous. Even if every family in Millerville contributed to their cause, raising such an amount would be nearly impossible. "What happens if the payments can't be made?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "The land reverts to public ownership, and any improvements made become property of the territorial government. In practical terms, it means anyone living on that land would be considered squatters, subject to immediate removal." The legal trap was becoming clear. Catherine had started a process she, couldn't complete, and now the children's future depended on financial resources that simply didn't exist. Worse, Garrett's investigation would probably uncover the same information, giving him additional legal ammunition for removing the children. There might be another option, Morrison said hesitantly. The original incorporation papers for the community were never finalized, but they were properly filed. If someone with legal standing wanted to assume responsibility for the project, the territorial government might be willing to negotiate new payment terms. What kind of legal standing? One, Doc asked. Well, ideally a family member of the deceased who could claim inheritance rights to the project. Someone who could demonstrate both the ability to care for the children and the community support necessary to make the settlement viable. Boone stared at the papers scattered across Morrison's desk. Seeing Catherine's careful handwriting and methodical planning, she'd come so close to making her dream reality, only to have it complicated by her untimely death. But perhaps there was still a way to honor her vision. What would I need to do? He asked quietly. Morrison consulted another book, this one bound in green leather and marked with territorial government seals. You'd need to formally claim inheritance of your sister's project, demonstrate community support for the settlement, and provide evidence of your ability to make the required payments. The territorial government would then review your application and either approve or deny the community charter. And if they approve, then you'd have legal authority to operate a chartered community for the care of displaced children, with all the rights and protections that entails. Samuel Garrett and the county would have no authority to interfere with your operations as long as you remained in compliance with territorial law. Hope flickered in Boone's chest like a candle flame in winter. Wind fragile, precious, and easily extinguished. The legal path existed, but the financial obstacles seemed insurmountable. $4,000 represented more money than most frontier families saw in a lifetime. How long do we have to file the inheritance claim? Doc asked. 60 days from the date of death. After that, the project becomes permanently dissolved, and the land purchases are cancelled. Morrison checked his calendar. That gives you about 5 weeks, assuming Sister Catherine died when the children say she did. 5 weeks to raise $4,000, gain community support, and navigate territorial bureaucracy. It seemed impossible, but then again, so had caring for 300 orphans on a remote mountain. Maybe the impossible was just another word for things that required more faith than fear. I'll need copies of all these documents, Boone said, and any forms required for filing the inheritance claim. You're really going to try this? Morrison asked. Those children trusted my sister with their lives, and she trusted me with their future. I'm not going to let bureaucratic convenience destroy what she died trying to create. As Morrison prepared the necessary papers, Boone found himself thinking about the legal documents artifact that would either save or doom their mountain community. These weren't just papers, they represented Catherine's final gift to him, her way of forcing him to rejoin the human family he'd abandoned after losing his own. But now, the real work would begin. Convincing the territorial government was only the first step. He still needed to find $4,000 and prove that a hermit and 300 orphans could build something worthy of legal protection. The afternoon sun was already sinking toward the western peaks when they left Morrison's office, their saddlebags heavy with documents and their minds heavy with the magnitude of the task ahead. As they rode back toward the mountain, Boone couldn't shake. The feeling that Catherine had somehow planned this too, that even her death was part of a larger strategy to force him into becoming the man these children needed him to be. Think it's possible? Doc asked as they began the climb toward home. Boone looked up at the mountain peaks, where smoke from their settlement fires painted thin lines against the darkening sky. Somewhere up there, 300 children were waiting for him to return with either salvation or confirmation of their fears. It has to be possible, he said simply, because impossible is the only choice we've got left. The news of Catherine's legal strategy spread through the mountain settlement like wildfire through dry timber. Children who'd been preparing for the worst suddenly found themselves energized by the possibility of legitimacy, of belonging somewhere permanently rather than being shuffled from place to place like unwanted baggage. But the financial reality tempered their excitement. $4,000 might as well have been $4 million to people who measured wealth in bowls of soup and warm places to sleep. Tommy called it more money than God, while Marcus muttered darkly about rich people's games that always ended with poor children losing. Boone spent the evening after his return to Millerville, carving furiously, his knife working pine wood into smooth curves while his mind wrestled with impossible mathematics. The wooden cross he was shaping would mark Catherine's grave properly, but more than that, it represented his need to channel nervous energy into something constructive before desperation drove him to destructive thoughts. She knew, didn't she? Lucy said, settling beside him with the quiet confidence of a child who'd claimed her place in his affections. Sister Catherine knew you'd figure out how to save us. I haven't figured out anything yet, little one, Boone replied, his voice gentle despite his turmoil. $4,000 is more money than this mountain has ever seen. But you're not giving up. The simple faith in her voice cut deeper than any blade. These children had already survived the loss of their orphanage, a deadly winter journey, and the death of their protector. Now they were watching him to see if the adults in their lives would fail them once again. No, he said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. I'm not giving up. Over the following days, word of their situation spread beyond the mountain in ways that surprised everyone involved. Doc Hensley, it turned out, had been quietly building support for their cause during his regular visits to neighboring communities. Pastor Williams had mentioned their plight during Sunday services, not asking for money, but simply requesting prayers for the mountain family that's found each other in unexpected ways. Sarah May from the general store had taken it upon herself to organize the women of Millerville into what she called practical Christianity, sending supplies up the mountain and spreading word about Boone's transformation from hermit to patriarch. Even Mayor Patterson, initially skeptical about the whole situation, had begun defending their efforts after seeing the quality of craftsmanship in the furniture Tommy and the older boys had brought to trade for supplies. People are talking, Doc reported during one of his increasingly frequent visits. Not all of it favorable, mind you, but more supportive than you might expect. There's something about your story that appeals to folks, the idea of lost family finding each other again. Talking doesn't pay legal fees, Marcus pointed out with his characteristic bluntness. The boy had appointed himself chief skeptic of any plan that relied on other people's goodwill, a role that both annoyed and impressed Boone with its realistic assessment of human nature. No, but it builds the community support, Morrison mentioned, Doc replied. And it's already led to some concrete help. The church in Millerville has voted to contribute $50 to your cause. The Ladies' Auxiliary is organizing a benefit dinner. Even some of the ranchers are talking about contributing livestock or labor. $50 was a significant sum for a small church, but it represented barely 1% of what they needed. Still, it was a beginning, and Boone had learned that beginnings sometimes led to destinations no one had imagined possible. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tommy had been corresponding with churches along the route they'd traveled from Street Louis, writing careful letters that described their situation and Catherine's legal strategy. Most of the responses were sympathetic but offered only prayers and small donations. But one letter, forwarded through 3 different post offices, changed everything. It's from a lawyer in Street Louis, Tommy announced, his young face bright with excitement. He says he knew Sister Catherine, that she consulted with him about the legal aspects of establishing the community. Boone took the letter with trembling hands, squinting at the formal legal language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. But the essential message was clear. Catherine had established a charitable trust fund with contributions from various church organizations specifically intended to support the New Haven Community Project. How much? he asked, though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Nearly $2,000, Tommy replied. "And he says there are additional pledges that could bring the total close to 3,000 if the community can prove its viability. $2,000, 3,000 if they were fortunate." It still wasn't enough, but it reduced their seemingly impossible task to something merely difficult. They'd need to raise only $1,000 locally, a sum that might be achievable with enough community support and creative fundraising. "There's a catch," Tommy continued, his excitement tempered by experience with adult promises. "The money can only be released if we can prove legal ownership of the land and demonstrate that the community is actually functioning as intended. And we have to do it all before Garrett's deadline. 3 weeks. That's what remained of their grace period before the county official returned with authority to remove the children. 3 weeks to finalize land purchases, complete legal paperwork, and prove their worthiness to skeptical bureaucrats who'd probably never seen anything like their mountain settlement. Boone looked around at the children gathered in his cabin, faces that had become as familiar as sunrise, voices that had filled the silence he'd treasured for 10 years. They were watching him with a mixture of hope and fear, waiting for him to either save their world or acknowledge that it couldn't be saved. "We're going to need help," he said finally. "More help than I've ever asked for in my life. We need people in the valley to contribute money, materials, and labor. We need the territorial government to approve our application quickly. Most of all, we need to prove that 300 children and 1 reformed hermit can build something worth preserving." "What can we do?" asked Sarah, the teenage girl who'd become the unofficial organizer of domestic life in their settlement. "Everything," Boone replied. "We finish the cabins, establish proper schools, organize workshops that can generate income, and document every aspect of our community's operations. When the government inspectors come, they need to see not just a collection of refugees, but a functioning town with a viable future." The next 3 weeks became a whirlwind of activity that would have exhausted people twice their age. The children worked with desperate energy, knowing that every completed building, every organized activity, every sign of permanent settlement strengthened their case for legitimacy. Boone found himself riding down to Millerville almost daily, meeting with potential supporters, filing paperwork with territorial offices, and slowly building the coalition of community backing that Morrison had said would be essential. Some conversations were encouraging. Pastor Williams pledged the full support of his congregation, and several business owners offered materials at cost. Others were discouraging. Mayor Patterson worried about the precedent of supporting what he called irregular family arrangements, and more than a few townspeople questioned whether one man could properly supervise so many children. But gradually, support began to build. The benefit dinner raised nearly $200. A group of ranchers contributed building materials and labor for completing the settlement's infrastructure. Most importantly, prominent citizens began visiting the mountain to see for themselves what Boone and the children had accomplished. "It's remarkable," said Judge Morrison, Clarence's brother, after spending a day touring their settlement. "These children are healthier, better educated, and more industrious than most of the young people I see in established towns. If this isn't a proper family, it's a better substitute than anything the county could provide." With 1 week remaining before Garrett's return, they received final confirmation that Catherine's trust fund would be released, bringing their available funds to just over $3,000. Local contributions had added another $800, leaving them only $200 short of the full amount needed for the land purchase. The wooden cross Boone had been carving was finally complete, a simple but elegant marker that captured Catherine's quiet dignity and unwavering faith. As he prepared to place it on her grave, he found himself speaking to her spirit as if she could still hear him. "I understand now what you were doing," he said, running his fingers over the smooth wood. "You weren't just bringing me children to care for you, were bringing me back to life. You were giving me a chance to be the man Martha always said I could be." Lucy appeared beside him, as she so often did during his moments of reflection. "Are we really going to make it?" she asked, slipping her small hand into his larger one. Boone looked down at the child who'd become as dear to him as his own daughter had been, then up at the settlement where 300 children had created a community from nothing but determination and mutual care. "Yes," he said, and for the first time since Catherine's death, he truly believed it. "We're going to make it." Samuel Garrett arrived at precisely 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, just as he'd promised 3 weeks earlier. But instead of the small enforcement party he'd implied, he brought a delegation that included territorial officials, county representatives, and what appeared to be a court stenographer prepared to document whatever proceedings were about to unfold. The hearing was to be held in Millerville's town hall, the only building large enough to accommodate the expected crowd. By 8:30, every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls, spilling out onto the street. Word had spread throughout the region about the unusual case, 300 orphans, a hermit turned father, and a legal battle that would determine whether love and community could triumph over bureaucratic convenience. Boone sat at a table near the front, flanked by Doc Hensley and Pastor Williams, with legal documents spread before him like ammunition for a battle he wasn't sure he understood how to fight. Behind him, the children filled row after row of wooden chairs, their faces grave with the knowledge that their future hung in the balance of adult conversations about laws and precedents. Tommy had wanted to bring all 300 children to the hearing, but practical considerations had limited their representation to the 50 oldest. Still, their presence transformed the normally staid town hall into something resembling a family gathering, with quiet whispers and nervous energy crackling through the air. Judge Harrison Morrison, Clarence's older brother and the territorial representative, called the hearing to order with the same solemnity he'd bring to a murder trial. He was a stern man with grey whiskers and eyes that missed nothing, known throughout the territory for fairness tempered by strict adherence to legal protocol. "This hearing will determine the legal status of the settlement on Elk Ridge and the custody arrangements for the minor children currently residing there," Judge Morrison announced. "Mr. Garrett, please present your case for the county." Garrett rose with the confidence of a man accustomed to bureaucratic victories. He dressed formally for the occasion, his dark suit and official bearing designed to emphasize the authority of his position. "Your Honor, the county's position is straightforward," Garrett began, consulting notes from a leather portfolio. "Mr. Boone Carver is attempting to care for 300 minor children without proper legal authority, adequate resources, or appropriate supervision. These children belong in established institutions where trained professionals can ensure their welfare." He gestured toward Boone with obvious disdain. "Mr. Carver has lived as a hermit for 10 years, deliberately avoiding human contact and responsibility. He has no experience with childcare, no education in proper pedagogical methods, and no legal standing as guardian for these children." The judge's gavel represented more than judicial authority. It symbolized the power of law versus the power of love, institutional control versus family bonds. Each tap against the wooden block seemed to echo through the hall like a heartbeat, marking time in a proceeding that would determine whether bureaucratic efficiency could triumph over human compassion. "Furthermore," Garrett continued, "the living conditions on Elk Ridge are primitive and dangerous. These children are housed in crude cabins without proper medical facilities, educational resources, or adult supervision ratios mandated by territorial law." Murmurs of disagreement rippled through the crowd, but Judge Morrison's stern gaze quickly restored order. Boone felt his hands clenching involuntarily as he listened to his community described as primitive and dangerous, his children characterized as neglected and endangered. "The county is prepared to transport these children to appropriate facilities where they can receive proper care," Garrett concluded. "We have arrangements with institutions in Denver, St. Louis, and Chicago that can accommodate them immediately." "Separate institutions," Tommy whispered loud enough for half the hall to hear. They want to split us up and send us to different cities. Judge Morrison turned his attention to Boone's table. Mr. Carver, you may present your response. Boone rose on unsteady legs, suddenly aware that 300 young lives depended on his ability to speak persuasively about matters he barely understood. The legal arguments Doc Hensley had helped him prepare seemed to dissolve in his mind, leaving only the simple truth of what they'd built together on the mountain. "Your Honor," he began, his voice stronger than he'd expected. "Mr. Garrett speaks of proper facilities and trained professionals, but he's describing institutions that treat children like problems to be managed rather than human beings to be loved." He gestured toward the children filling the back of the hall. "These aren't neglected waifs waiting for salvation. They're a family that chose each other, that worked together to build something better than anything the county could provide for them." "Mr. Carver," Judge Morrison interrupted, "do you have legal documentation supporting your custody of these children?" Doc Hensley leaned forward, spreading Sister Catherine's papers across the table. "Your Honor, we have extensive documentation showing that these children were legally placed in Mr. Carver's care by his sister, Sister Catherine Carver, who had proper authority over their welfare. And the land ownership question? We have proof of payment for the first installment on an 800-acre purchase, along with territorial approval for establishing a chartered community specifically designed for child welfare." Judge Morrison examined the documents with the careful attention of someone trained to spot legal irregularities. As he read, his stern expression began to soften slightly, though he maintained his judicial neutrality. "These documents appear to be in order," he said finally. "However, Mr. Garrett raises valid concerns about living conditions and supervision standards. How do you respond to allegations that the settlement lacks adequate facilities?" Before Boone could respond to the judge's question about facilities, Pastor Williams rose from his seat with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to addressing congregations in times of crisis. "Your Honor, if I may," the pastor said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed hall. "I've visited the Elk Ridge settlement multiple times over the past month. I believe the court should hear testimony from community members who have observed these children's living conditions firsthand." Judge Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "The court will hear such testimony. Pastor Williams, you may proceed." "Thank you, Your Honor." The pastor moved to address the room directly, his bearing that of a man delivering a sermon he'd prepared carefully. "What Mr. Garrett describes as primitive conditions are actually well-constructed log cabins with proper foundations, stone fireplaces, and weatherproofing that would be the envy of many established homesteads," he gestured toward the children in the gallery. "More importantly, these young people have built something remarkable, a community where every child has a role, every person contributes according to their ability, and no one is forgotten or left behind." "That's hardly evidence of proper supervision," Garrett interjected. "Children need adult guidance, not simply the company of other children." Doc Hensley stood, his considerable bulk lending weight to his words. "If I may address that concern, Your Honor, as the settlement's medical advisor, I've examined every child multiple times. Their health has improved dramatically since arriving on the mountain. They show none of the signs of neglect or malnutrition commonly found in institutional settings. Furthermore," Doc continued, warming to his subject, "Mr. Carver has established educational programs, work training, and character development that exceed anything I've observed in formal institutions. These children aren't just surviving, they're thriving." Judge Morrison turned his attention back to Boone. "Mr. Carver, the court needs to understand your legal authority for caring for these children. Can you establish proper guardianship under territorial law?" This was the moment they'd prepared for, the legal foundation upon which everything else depended. Boone took a deep breath and reached for the document that had arrived just that morning, a final piece of Catherine's legal strategy that he'd only discovered through correspondence with her lawyer in Street Lewis. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "I present the court with my sister's last will and testament, filed properly with church authorities in Street Louis and witnessed according to territorial requirements." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Morrison examined the document. Catherine had been more thorough than anyone had imagined. Not only had she legally designated Boone as guardian for the children in case of her death, but she'd also transferred her legal authority over the community project to him through properly executed inheritance procedures. "This appears to grant you full legal custody," Judge Morrison said, his voice betraying a hint of surprise. "However, custody is only valid if you can demonstrate the ability to provide adequate care. The court still needs assurance that these children's welfare is being properly protected." Tommy stood up in the gallery, his young voice cutting through the formal proceedings with startling clarity. "Your Honor, may I speak for the children?" "This is highly irregular," Garrett protested. "Children aren't qualified to testify about their own welfare." "The court will hear the boy's statement," Judge Morrison ruled. "Proceed, young man." Tommy walked to the front of the room with the bearing of someone far older than his 15 years. When he turned to face the assembly, his words carried the weight of lived experience rather than legal theory. "Mr. Garrett says we need trained professionals to care for us," Tommy began. "But the trained professionals in our old orphanage fed us thin soup and made us sleep 4 to a bed. The trained professionals wanted to separate families and send children to different cities because it was more convenient for their paperwork." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "Mr. Boone teaches us useful skills and treats us like family. He carved toys for the little ones and taught us how to build real houses. He sits with sick children through the night and makes sure everyone has enough to eat before he takes a single bite himself." Lucy stood up in the gallery, her small voice adding to Tommy's testimony. "He gave me his mittens when mine were lost, and he reads to us in the evenings, and he never gets angry when we ask too many questions." One by one, other children began to stand, each adding their voice to a chorus of testimony that filled the hall with the simple truth of their experience. Marcus spoke of learning carpentry skills that would serve him his whole life. Sarah described the school they'd established, where older children taught younger ones, and everyone learned together. Judge Morrison raised his hand for silence, but his expression had shifted from stern neutrality to something approaching wonder. "The court appreciates these testimonies," he said. "However, we must also consider the practical requirements of territorial law regarding community establishment." This was when Pastor Williams produced the document that would change everything the original town charter for. Millerville, a yellowed piece of parchment that established the legal precedent they needed. "Your Honor," the pastor said, approaching the judge's bench with reverent care. Millerville itself was established under territorial provisions that allowed for communal child-rearing and shared responsibility for orphaned children. The same legal framework that legitimized our town's founding applies directly to the New Haven settlement. The town charter represented more than historical precedent. It symbolized belonging and acceptance, the legal recognition that communities could form around bonds of choice rather than blood, that families could be created through love rather than birth. Judge Morrison studied the charter with the careful attention of a man, realizing that legal precedent supported the very situation he'd been asked to dissolve. The silence in the courtroom stretched until it seemed almost unbearable. Finally, he looked up at the assembled crowd, his gaze taking in the children, the community supporters, and the county officials who'd come expecting a routine removal order. "The court will recess for 1 hour to consider the evidence presented," he announced, his gavel echoing through the hall with the finality of fate itself. The hour-long recess felt like an eternity compressed into moments. Outside the town hall, the people of Millerville mingled with the children from Elk Ridge, conversations flowing between groups that had been strangers only weeks before. Boone watched as Lucy showed several townspeople the wooden toys he'd carved for her, while Tommy discussed construction techniques with local carpenters who seemed genuinely impressed by their mountain settlement's craftsmanship. When Judge Morrison's gavel called them back to order, the silence that fell over the packed hall was so complete that the sound of snow beginning to fall against the windows seemed thunderous. The judge had arranged several documents on his desk, including Catherine's will, the land purchase agreements, and the territorial charter that had established legal precedent. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, Judge Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. This court finds that the children currently residing at the Elk Ridge settlement are not neglected, abandoned, or endangered as claimed by county representatives. Relief rippled through the hall like a physical wave, but the judge raised his hand for continued silence. Furthermore, the court recognizes that Mr. Boone Carver has legal authority as guardian for these children through properly executed inheritance of his sister's custodial rights. The settlement known as New Haven is hereby granted preliminary recognition as a chartered community under territorial law. The cheer that erupted from the children's section was quickly hushed, but not before every adult in the room had heard the pure joy in their voices. Even Judge Morrison's stern expression softened slightly at the sound. However, he continued, and the word fell like a hammer blow, this recognition is contingent upon several conditions that must be met within 6 months. Boone felt his stomach tighten. Legal victories, it seemed, always came with strings attached. First, the community must demonstrate financial stability through completion of all land purchase agreements. Second, formal educational programs must be established under territorial oversight. Third, adequate medical facilities and qualified supervision must be maintained according to territorial standards. Judge Morrison's gaze settled on Samuel Garrett, whose face had gone pale with bureaucratic defeat. Mr. Garrett, the county is hereby directed to provide support rather than interference for this community's development. These children have found family, and family should be preserved whenever possible. Your Honor, Garrett protested weakly, the precedent this sets could encourage other irregular arrangements. The precedent this sets, Judge Morrison replied with finality, is that the territory of Colorado recognizes love and commitment over bureaucratic convenience when determining the welfare of children. As the formal proceedings concluded and people began filing out of the hall, Boone found himself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters whose enthusiasm overwhelmed his mountain hermit sensibilities. But through the crowd, he spotted the one face that mattered most, Lucy, whose smile outshone the winter sun streaming through the hall's tall windows. The months that followed brought changes that would have been impossible to imagine during those first desperate days when 300 children had appeared at his cabin door. The New Haven community grew into exactly what Catherine had envisioned, a place where lost families could find each other and build something lasting. By spring, they'd completed construction of a proper school, a medical clinic staffed by Doc Hensley during his extended mountain residencies, and workshops where the older children learned trades that would serve them throughout their lives. The territorial inspector who visited in late May reported that New Haven's educational programs exceeded standards found in most established towns. The financial challenges had resolved themselves through a combination of community support, the children's own industrious efforts, and what Pastor Williams called divine providence. Their furniture and crafted goods found eager markets throughout the territory, while their agricultural efforts promised self-sufficiency within another growing season. But perhaps the most significant change was in Boone himself. The hermit of Elk Ridge had become Papa Boone to 300 children, his days filled with the chaos and joy of family life on an unimaginable scale. His evening routine now included bedtime stories for the youngest children, homework help for the older ones, and quiet conversations with teenagers who sought his counsel on matters of growing up in an uncertain world. On a warm evening in early autumn, as the first anniversary of their arrival approached, Boone sat on his porch whittling a new spoon while Lucy practiced reading aloud from one of Martha's old books. The portrait artist, from Denver, had finished his work that afternoon, a large painting that captured not just the faces of their mountain family, but something of the spirit that bound them together. The new family portrait would hang in their meeting hall, a testament to the healing power of chosen family and the transformative nature of love freely given. Unlike the faded daguerreotype that still held place of honor on Boone's mantelpiece, this painting showed not what had been lost, but what had been found and carefully built together. "Papa Boone?" Lucy asked, looking up from her reading. "Do you think Sister Catherine knew this would happen? All of it, I mean?" Boone considered the question while his knife shaped wood into useful form. Around them, the sounds of their community filled the evening air. Children playing after supper, teenagers discussing tomorrow's work projects, the comfortable murmur of a family settled into the rhythms of home. "I think your Sister Catherine understood. Something I'd forgotten," he said finally. "That love doesn't end when people die. It just finds new ways to grow." Lucy nodded seriously, then returned to her reading. But after a moment, she looked up again with the impish smile that had first captured his heart in those desperate early days. "I'm glad she brought us home to you," she said simply. "Home." The words settled around Boone's shoulders like a warm blanket, encompassing everything from the log cabins, scattered across their mountain valley, to the painted portrait that proclaimed their bond to anyone who cared to look. He'd spent 10 years believing that home was something you lost and mourned, never something you could build again from hope and hard work. As the last light faded from the western peaks and the children began their nightly migration toward warm beds and peaceful sleep, Boone understood that Catherine's greatest gift hadn't been saving 300 orphans from institutional care. Her greatest gift had been saving him from the prison of his own grief, showing him that love multiplied rather than divided when shared among many hearts. The mountain that had been his place of exile had become his place of belonging. The children who'd arrived as strangers had become his legacy, and the hermit who'd thought his story was over had discovered it was just beginning.